Pour bien t'expliquer comment j'ai appris le français, je dois te raconter aussi l'histoire de ma vie. Non, mais sans blague. I received this comment from Alexia in Bloom. Alexia says, I've recently restarted my French journey and I am sorting out my study routine and figuring out what works and what doesn't. I get overwhelmed thinking of the work ahead of me, but your calming energy and relaxed attitude is so inspiring. I would love to hear more about your French journey. I think that would be a good idea for the future. Well, Alexia, thank you so much for the question. Pour être honnête, mon apprentissage du français ne se déroule pas juste en vase clos. Et je dois te donner un petit peu de contexte sur la société où j'ai grandi. Pour l'essentiel, c'est ici au Vietnam. Et c'est en fait une histoire plus grande que moi, plus longue que la mienne. Et c'est une histoire qui concerne la génération de mes parents, voire même celle de mes grands-parents et surtout la période avant ça. Voilà, ce sera comme un petit cours d'histoire. Donc, prends une boisson ou une collation et on va commencer au début du XVIIe siècle. So at the beginning of the 17th century, Alexandre de Rhodes, who was a French missionary from Paris, came over to Vietnam to spread the doctrines of the French Catholic Church. However, he was met with a little problem, and it was the fact that here in Vietnam, at the time, the national script was a character-based system derived from that of Chinese. So if you're familiar with Mandarin, you'd be able to recognize a lot of these characters. However, there are minor differences based on some extra strokes or radicals that have been added, that have been Vietnamesized. And as you could imagine, trying to spread the Bible using logographic characters is not a simple task at all. You have to teach everyone thousands and thousands of characters instead of being able to rely on the fact that they can read for themselves. So what did Mr. de Rhodes do? He developed a phonetic alphabet for the Vietnamese language using the Latin lettering system. And to this day, it is still the official alphabet that we use in all of our documentation. So now that a Latin alphabet has been developed, it becomes much easier to teach and spread the Bible. Okay, so fast forward 200 years and it takes us to the 1850s. And this is when the French returned to Vietnam again, this time to exert colonial influence. Not long after, it was exerted also onto Cambodia and Laos, which together, the three countries, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, is commonly known as the Indochina or the French Indochina colony back in the days. And this is a detail that I will be referring back to later on in this video. Anyways, the French was here in Vietnam from the 1850s up until the 1950s, which is just shy of 100 years. And all four of my grandparents were born in the 1920s, 1930s, which meant that they grew up, went to school, became adults, got professional careers, all while the French was still very much present. And all four of my grandparents actually learned French to a great extent, actually. And they all used French professionally in their careers in the field of medicine. I believe my maternal grandparents, so my mom's parents, also spent a couple years in Algeria, also a former French colony, in the medical field, and so they used French in their daily lives there. So fast forward to my parents' generation, the 1950s and 60s. By this point in time, the French had left the country, but obviously there would still be influence lingering around. And my parents and their siblings, so my mom and dad and aunties and uncles, I'm pretty sure most of them learned French to different extents in school. Like my mom learned 3 years of French in high school as her second language. Pretty sure my uncle did the same. I mean, it was my grandparents' decision to put them in French, so there's that. So my parents and aunties and uncles can probably understand French to varying levels, especially if they had received some sort of professional training in France. Now we zoom in a little bit more on the story onto my mom. She is a pediatrician who received the majority of her education and training, her undergrad, if you will, in St. Petersburg, Russia. And after that, she did a year of her medical residency in France, 6 months of which were in Paris and 6 months in the outskirts, dans les banlieues. And during her residency there, she met a French nurse and they became really good friends. That French nurse later on became my brother and I. She became our godmother. Now we fast forward to the change of the millennium and finally I'm born and I enter the story. I remember it being like 4, 5-ish. Back then our godmother would send us like textbooks. Textbooks is kind of a stretch. It's like a picture book. And my mom would teach my brother and I basic French, pronunciation, stuff like that. Thinking back, like I would have to fact check this with my mom, but I have a feeling that maybe I was exposed to French even before I was exposed to English, obviously to a lesser extent. But still. And after that, our family moved to Australia for a couple years. That's where I learned English. And then we moved to Laos. We move around every couple years due to my dad's job at the time. When I moved to Laos, I was entering 5th grade, so about 9 years old. And my mom put my older brother and I into French weekend school at the l'Institut Français du Laos au Vientiane. 3 hours once a week. I do recall having a Lao teacher who spoke very good French. And again, this relates back to French Indochina. Laos was also a former French colony, right? I remember spending a decent amount of time in the library after class and reading a lot of like Tintin, Tintin, Asterix, along with like a lot of French magazines for kids. I feel like that was pretty popular back then, or in the French-speaking world. And the funny thing is, like, recently I was at the French Institute here in Hanoi at the library, checking out books, and I flipped through, like, those comic books, like Asterix and Tintin, and honestly, it's, like, not easy at all. So I'm surprised that those comics made such a big impression on me back then. I feel like my mom would not have been one to read that to me because she's not big on comics at all. She's much more an advocate for like picture books or long text with illustrations and stuff like that. But anyways, probably my brother. I feel like my brother would have been the one to read those stories to me. The main reason why we attended a year of weekend French school was because at the end of the school year, we had a trip to France. And we spent 3 weeks in the outskirts of Paris again with my godmother and her parents. So my mamie et papy. C'était une période très tranquille. Pas de grand chose se passe là-bas, mais je me souviens que je l'aimais bien. Et on passait beaucoup de temps dans le jardin de papy. Il y a beaucoup de fraises, un arbre, de cerises aussi, des abricots. And we harvested a lot of that. Et parfois, on visitait aussi les autres villes pas plus loin de ça, comme Paris, bien sûr, mais aussi Versailles, le château. Et si je ne me trompe pas, Fontainebleau. Need to fact check this. After 3 weeks, we left France, and I have not been back since. And that was about 15-ish years ago. And I did not touch French either for another 10 years until I was like 20, 21-ish. My brother did end up taking French at the French Institute here in Hanoi up until like B1 level, but I just kind of stopped. There wasn't really a specific reason for it. I picked it up again when I had graduated uni, so that would be Emma age 20, 21. When I came back to Vietnam from the States, I immediately picked up an English tutoring gig. And the thing was that when I teach my students English, if they ask me something related to the grammar, I don't know how to explain it to them at all because I had learned English at a very young age in a native speaker environment too, back in Australia. So I don't really recall having the experience of learning English as a second language. And so when my students would ask me about grammar, all I could really tell them was like, hey, you can feel it. But obviously that was not how my students' brains operated. I needed to put myself back into the shoes of a language learner to really understand where they're coming from and how to troubleshoot these things. So I decided to pick up French again for 2 reasons. The first is that I already have some bases in French, so it made sense to carry on from there. And second of all, there are a lot of similarities between English and French. I encountered problems with French grammar or learning vocabulary again or learning to pronounce properly again. I would figure out ways around this, and then I would apply that to my English tutoring gig. And that proved to be quite effective. I could understand where my students were coming from now. I could connect more with their experience of learning a foreign language. I think I studied by myself for a handful of months, and then I did have a tutor for about 2.5 months-ish. After that, Korean came along, and the Mandarin came along, and I just keep on collecting new languages like Pokemon cards. And then we fast forward to the end of 2024, the beginning of 2025, so just over a year ago, which was when I stumbled upon the book Le Français par la méthode nature, which is a method that was published in the 1950s that teaches you a language through the language itself without any translations into any other language. As a language tutor, I am a sucker for good learning resources. So when I stumbled upon this resource, I decided, why not test this out? I think I was learning Mandarin at the time, and French was not on my radar at all, but somehow it kind of took over. And these textbooks aren't exclusive to just French. They also have versions for English, German, Italian. The Russian one exists, but is missing from the internet, which is a shame. I spent 3 months on that textbook, and I reviewed it in a video over there. And after that, I spent about 8 months learning French passively. And by that, I mean just simply reading French books for children that I borrow at the library. A little bit of Le Petit Nicolas, as recommended by you guys, before I eventually read the second book in the Nature Method series, which is their introduction to literature, Initiation à la littérature française. It is a compilation of 7 stories that had been selected very intentionally to introduce you to the works of notable French authors. And I feel like the book definitely lives up to its name, because I feel like I did get a glimpse into what French literature could be, or more so like the fact that I can approach French literature without it being too overwhelming. It wouldn't be way too beyond my league, And my review of that is also right over there. As I've continued to learn French, whether it was the first time round back in 2021 or this time round with the Nature Method books, whenever I discover a new way of learning a language, and new here means new to me, not new in the existence of everything. 1, I share it here on this platform, but also 2, I apply it back into my tutoring job, and it just so happens that the universe sort of sends me students who would need this exact approach that I had just stumbled upon. My most recent student, I also have them now, dipping their toes into English literature as a way of developing their language in a more well-rounded way. These students come to me to learn test prep, and I'm of the mind that learning test prep for too long becomes quite boring, and you could even get scared of the English language itself. So let's build up your foundation with English literature. Let's expose you to good, notable authors of the English-speaking world. And once we get your English up to a good level, you've fallen in love with English, you can now sustain yourself off of these books. We will apply test prep approaches, test prep techniques, if you will. And I feel like maybe that is the reason why I keep on learning French. I keep discovering new things in the journey of learning language in French, and then I get to apply it into English. That is where I am right now. Right now I am reading Albert Camus' L'étranger. This is my main studying material at this point. I'm listening to the audiobook and also shadowing along to the audio, coloring in little phrases that are useful, and searching for their definitions as well to understand the story more. Yeah, I'm not completely overwhelmed by this material, which is quite encouraging. And at the same time, I'm also reading this book for leisure, Le roman d'Ernest et Célestine. And it is a story about a bear and a mouse who became an unlikely pair of friends. And then there's this one excerpt that I read this morning actually that I really like. And it's called chapter 20, Après. And it's about le bonheur, happiness. Il paraît que le bonheur ne se raconte pas. Il paraît que c'est très ennuyeux, le bonheur. Il paraît qu'il ne se passe rien chez les gens heureux. Ils sont heureux et puis c'est tout. Comme si le temps s'était arrêté. Rien à raconter à ce qu'on dit. Je suis pas de cet avis, mais alors pas du tout. Je pense même que si on devait raconter tout le bonheur d'Ernest et Célestine, il faudrait des milliards de pages. Parce que le bonheur, c'est à la fois immense et minuscule. Pour décrire l'immense bonheur d'Ernest et Célestine, c'est facile. Il suffit d'une phrase. Ernest et Célestine étaient immensément heureux. Voilà, c'est fini. Mais pour décrire les mille et un petits bonheurs de ce bonheur immense, alors là, il faudra un énorme livre. Faisons une liste, rien que pour vous en donner une idée. And then the story goes on to list a dozen different ways in which these friends have moments of happiness. I think that's a beautiful thing because, yeah, a lot of stories just kind of like revolve around things happening. And then the story ends when the problem is resolved and then the main characters live happily ever after. But yeah, I think it's worth something to also note down the happy points, the happy times, you know? Bref, il faudrait des milliers de pages pour décrire le bonheur d'Ernest et Célestine, parce que chaque seconde de leur amitié était une seconde de bonheur. Beautiful. So that is my leisure reading. As opposed to L'étranger, let me read you the first paragraph. It's a lot darker, might I warn you. Aujourd'hui, maman est morte. Ou peut-être hier, je sais pas. J'ai reçu un télégramme de l'asile. Mère décédée. Enterrement demain. Sentiment distingué. Cela ne veut rien dire. C'était peut-être hier. The contrast in vibe is something else, must I say. So yeah, all in all, my journey with French is much bigger than me. It lives on in the society, in the city that I live in. If you were to visit Hanoi, Vietnam right now, there are still lots of remnants of French influence, things that you would notice as a tourist. The first would be the architecture and landscape architecture. So that is the way the buildings are built, the shutter windows that are very reminiscent of Europe, and also the layout of the old parts of the city, the original parts of Hanoi.
Tiến vào quảng trường Ba Đình.
The trees that line the roads were also chosen by French horticulturalists, arborists, and planted there. So these trees are most likely older than most, if not all, of the citizens living in this city. Now, French has also had a great influence on the Vietnamese language in loanwords, and these loanwords usually concern like concepts that we did not have prior to the French coming here. So a lot of it has to do with like automobile parts. So think like a car, volant, coque, coffre, ceinture, ceinture, I believe, like a safety belt. A bunch of other words as well. So I'm going to say all of these words in Vietnamese, and French speakers can tell me in the comments below what words you hear in French. Okay, so these words are personal items, household items type thing. Divan, balo, xà phòng, xà bông, vali, tạp dề. Basically anything with two or more syllables, because Vietnamese is a monosyllabic language, very similar to that of Mandarin. Yes, concepts can be made up of two or more words, but each individual word itself, one syllable long. So any word that we have that is of two syllables or three syllables, we know with like 99% certainty that it was loaned from French. Oh, like a lot of like dairy as well. I guess like historically we're lactose intolerant, so we didn't have milk in that sense. So a lot of words we use for dairy products are also derived from French, like game, beurre, fromage. I have the feeling that the French language and I will probably accompany each other for a long time. I'm starting to be able to consume native material, native podcasts, reality TV type thing. For me, it's still a little bit difficult, especially when there are like multiple speakers going at the same time. But for the most part, not too bad. So my listening and my reading skills they're right. My writing skills probably the weakest, and my speaking skills doesn't get practiced much either, but I don't necessarily mind it. Do I have French friends that I speak to often? Yes. Do I speak to them in French? No. And you might ask why, and it is the fact that I prioritize communication with them, because when I speak in French, it just slows down everything. So we just sort of stick to English when we're communicating. So that was a very long story to answer your question of what my French journey was. And voilà. Histoire de ma vie. Much longer than my life, actually, if you think about it. I don't know what this journey will hold for me in the future, but I know for now that I am really enjoying learning French through literature, understanding more of the roots, the influence on this country, on this city, getting more of a glimpse into my parents' lives, my grandparents' lives, things of that nature. How about you guys? How did you get into learning French in the first place, and how is it going? Do you have any family ties to this language? How does that change the way that you see your mother tongue, perhaps? Or what are some of your favorite discoveries from learning French? Thank you guys for watching this video. I hope you learned something new. I know I did in preparation for the history part of this video. You guys have an absolutely wonderful week, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!